We live in a world that often treats empty space as something to be feared. Silence is viewed as a vacuum that must be filled. This discomfort drives a compulsion to fill our lives with metrics, notification loops, and the endless accumulation of status. Chapter 4 of the Daodejing offers a different perspective on this void, beginning with a fundamental cosmological assertion. Lao Tzu describes the Tao, the underlying order of the universe, as an empty vessel, or Chong. He calls it fathomless and deep, Yuan. In this philosophical context, emptiness, Shu, signified something very different from nihilism or a structural lack. It represents the purest form of unlabeled, unconditioned potential. Lao Tzu frames this state as the primeval ancestor, the source that allows all material things to take shape. Viewed through this lens, the fear of emptiness is a misunderstanding of the universe's most vital state of potential. Moving from the cosmos to human society, Chapter 3 of the Daodejing warns about the structures we build to avoid this emptiness. The text focuses on Wu-Wei, forced, ego-driven striving, and the demand for constant output. When we praise external status metrics, we create rigid social hierarchies that trap individuals in a loop of constant comparison. If a human mind or an organizational system becomes oversaturated with the noise of artificial desires, it loses its ability to adapt. This oversaturation results in a state of chronic psychological stress, where the system's capacity to function effectively begins to stall. Chapter 4 suggests a profound alternative to this rigidity, a return toward that primeval emptiness. This return fosters a state of psychological fluidity, allowing for renewal and creativity without depleting the system. Deliberately maintaining structural emptiness serves as a requirement to prevent systemic exhaustion. Modern theoretical physics provides a framework that clarifies the nature of this empty vessel by examining the properties of a physical vacuum. This chart maps a system's energy states. In quantum field theory, the absolute lowest state, the vacuum, is never truly empty. It is filled with zero-point energy, a dynamic field bubbling with virtual particles that appear and disappear rapidly, forming unconditioned potential. All material reality is constructed from the fluctuations within this field. This physical engine operates without being depleted, reflecting the empty vessel described in the Daodejing. Modern subatomic observations align with the ancient description of a source that operates eternally without exhaustion. At the most fundamental level of reality, the vacuum functions as a field of infinite potential. This principle of potential also appears in human neurobiology and the architecture of the brain. Much of our lives are dominated by extrinsic cognition, where we focus on external goals and workplace metrics. This leads to hypervigilance, constantly scanning for cues that might affect our social status. This narrow focus on short-term survival and social positioning consumes a significant portion of our cognitive capacity. Under these conditions, the prefrontal cortex enters a state of chronic, high-friction stress. This state measurably impairs complex decision-making. Reversing this impairment requires a cessation of external stimulation and ego-driven compulsions. When the noise stops, the default mode network, or DMN, activates. The DMN becomes active only when the mind reaches a state of quietude and psychological emptiness. This biological state is identified as Louvre to use, or creative emptiness. DMN activation is what allows the brain to construct deep creative insights and process complex emotional experiences. Psychological quietude functions as a biological necessity for human flourishing and self-regulation. The cosmic void and our internal cognitive networks reflect a single principle. We often believe our value is determined by how much we accumulate, but constant accumulation eventually exhausts the very system that holds it. Chapter 4 of the Daodejing invites us to look instead at the empty space within the vessel. The utility of a cup is not found in its rigid clay walls. Its value is found in the emptiness that allows it to hold something new. Biological and physical structures exist to facilitate the potential of the empty space they contain. Modern quantum physics and ancient Taoist thought converge on this understanding of the vacuum. The quantum vacuum stands as the most powerful field in the known universe. This space of apparent nothingness is exactly where creative energy begins. Reaching this energy requires us to step away from the pursuit of artificial status and metrics. This involves creating intentional emptiness in both mind and workspace. By stepping away from the chase for external validation, our true potential emerges. Nothingness serves as a state of readiness. Emptiness functions as the birthplace of everything. Modern social structures reward a state of hyper-competitive ascent. We operate within a manufactured contest for hierarchical dominance, where the drive for status generates constant friction against our shared reality. This hubristic pursuit of material superiority compromises an individual's psychological resilience, leaving the mind in a state of perpetual defensive alert. The middle verses of the Daodejing, Chapter 4, present a counterintuitive manual for psychological survival amid this pressure. These directives are not passive poetic ideals. They function as a deliberate, actionable deconstruction of the ego. Laozi writes, "It blunts its own sharp edges, unties its own knots, softens its own brilliant glare, and merges itself with the dust." This quiet humility contrasts sharply with the loud, performative signaling modern society requires. While culture demands we stand out, Laozi instructs us to recede. This ancient text provides a specific, clinically valid intervention for the social anxiety generated by contemporary material hierarchies. Laozi's sharp edges represent the aggressive psychological drives used to assert hierarchical dominance and project superiority over others. These edges form the combative perimeter of the ego, a rigid boundary maintained to signal status. The knots are the interpersonal and systemic conflicts that inevitably occur when two of these rigid, hyper-competitive egos collide. To resolve this friction, Laozi introduces Tong Chen, softening the glare and merging with the dust. This is a voluntary step back from the exhaustive cycle of performative social signaling. Stepping back into a shared human reality, the dust, neutralizes the friction generated by competing status claims. These four metaphors provide a mechanical framework for dismantling the narcissistic mind. Modern clinical psychology validates this ancient approach through the status pursuit in narcissism, or SPIN model. Developed by Grabsis and colleagues, the SPIN model identifies two primary pathways through which grandiose narcissism manifests in human transactions. The first is the admiration pathway. This loop involves assertive self-promotion, where the individual seeks attention and praise to stand out. The second is the rivalry pathway, which triggers when status expectations are threatened. This leads to other derogation, an antagonistic loop of belittling and devaluing competitors to protect one's standing. This clinical model mirrors the exact sharp edges and knots Laozi observed in human behavior. Laozi's directive to blunt the sharp edges is the mechanical act of deliberately cutting these two narcissistic feedback loops. Spiritual imbalance in this light is a clinically defined and destructive personality disorder. The consequences of these narcissistic pathways extend beyond the individual to the macro societal level. Research in political psychology by Peterson suggests that the drive for status via dominance is a primary factor in social instability. Motivations to gain status through intimidation and dominance drive extreme political discontent and hostility. When the rivalry pathway operates at a massive societal scale, it creates the systemic friction we recognize as social polarization. Laozi's instruction to soften the glare targets the dominance motivations that generate this widespread hostility. Voluntarily subduing the ego removes the status threat feedback loop, providing a scientifically sound mechanism for social depolarization. This process of subduing the ego is grounded in neurobiology. Contemporary neuroscience investigates these shifts through the study of ego dissolution. Identity and self-boundaries are maintained by the default mode network, or DMN, through a series of self-referential hubs. Hyperconnectivity within these hubs creates a biological state of hypervigilance regarding social evaluation, the sharp edges of constant self-monitoring. This state keeps cortisol levels elevated, maintaining the body in a continuous stress response. Merging with the dust corresponds to a measurable shift in this network's activity. When connectivity within the DMN's hubs is suppressed, the rigid boundaries of the self vanish. This suppression normalizes cortisol and subdues defensiveness, shifting the brain into a flow state characterized by increased integrative problem-solving capacity. This neurobiological shift removes the cognitive bottleneck of ego preservation. By increasing the brain's capacity to process complex social information without defensive interference, it provides the biological means to resolve the conflicts Laozi called knots. Clinical psychology, sociology, and neurobiology converge on a single point: the high cost of the hyper-competitive ego. Hyper-competitive dominance is often mistaken for an optimal survival strategy. The data suggests otherwise. Humility is a biologically superior state of cognitive processing. Our modern culture commands us to sharpen our edges, to be hyper-competitive, to stand out at all costs, to project a blinding glare of success, and to dominate our social hierarchies. But data shows that this frantic, narcissistic status-seeking only churns our minds and fragments our communities. The Daodejing offers a manual for psychological resilience. Blunt the sharp edges, untie the knots, and soften the performative glare. When you stop trying to project superiority and instead merge with the dust, embracing your shared human connection, the manufactured friction of status anxiety evaporates. True power doesn't come from fracturing the world with your ego. It comes from ruling with it in peace. We often exhaust ourselves trying to micromanage complex organizations, operating on the assumption that order must be forced. Yet the natural world achieves vast, seamless coordination in its ecosystems without a single invisible director giving orders. Over 2 millennia ago, the philosopher Laozi identified this effortless mechanic, naming it the Tao, an unseen operating system for managing complex environments. In our previous chapter, we saw how artificially forced environments breed caution. When a central authority relies on rigid metrics, the system stops seeking excellence and starts seeking ways to avoid punishment. Laozi proposed an alternative, a non-hierarchical, bottom-up principle of harmony that steers immense complexity from within rather than from above. This suggests that the highest form of authority is one that doesn't need to be seen. It functions because the system's architecture is designed to regulate itself. In Chapter 4 of the Daodejing, Laozi uses fluid, descriptive prose to map out the mechanics of this hidden architecture. He defines the Tao by what is absent, the absence of visible, grasping control. He uses the term humamatu, translating to unfathomable. Laozi likens this to a fathomless pool of water. It appears to exist eternally, guiding everything without needing to obstruct or collide. This metaphor provides a structural definition, an architecture that provides order and direction without the friction of forceful imposition. Operating within this architecture requires Wu-Wei, action that takes the form of non-intervention. In practice, Wu-Wei steers a system by setting the environmental parameters first, rather than demanding performative control in the moment. The authority shifts from the leader to the system's own structural integrity, removing the need for coercive power. Modern systems theory provides a technical framework for Laozi's ancient axioms. What the Daodejing calls the Tao, modern science identifies as a complex adaptive system. These systems are visible in forest mycelium networks and starling murmurations. Thousands of individuals move in perfect synchronization without a single bird leading the flight. This occurs through emergent coordination. A global order appears naturally, even though no central conductor gives cues. Each element follows local rules, responding to fluid environmental parameters and its immediate neighbors. These localized autonomous reactions cascade instantly into highly coordinated macrostructures. This design offers a specific advantage over top-down control: systemic resilience. Because the order isn't forced by a central power, the system maintains its equilibrium without the exhaustion that comes from constant policing and oversight. By removing the single point of failure in central control, these self-organizing systems achieve a level of coordination and survival that rigid hierarchies cannot match. These mechanics are equally visible in human organizations. Dr. Ludmila Preslova's research explores how different corporate architectures dictate human behavior. The opposite of a self-organizing system is a fear culture, a structure built on the assumption that people only work under pressure. This model relies on strict surveillance and coercive metrics to drive performance from the top down. It often utilizes forced ranking curves and culling to create artificial motivation through the threat of termination. This pressure is architecturally destructive. It forces the human brain into a survival state, which drastically degrades cognitive bandwidth. As psychological safety vanishes, the very structure of the organization begins to fracture under its own weight. Forced control doesn't produce excellence. It produces a system optimized for deception, where individuals are incentivized to hide errors and game metrics to survive. When you manage by fear, the control you think you have is an illusion. You aren't building a high-performing system. You are engineering a fragile structure. Dr. Proslova points to a different path, the evidence-based performance culture. This model treats trust and safety not as perks, but as the essential structural bedrock of the organization. By replacing heavy-handed policing with structural autonomy, the organization adopts a decentralized design. In this ecosystem, individuals naturally begin to self-organize, mimicking the efficient coordination seen in biological networks. Because there is no fear of punishment, the need for concealment disappears, allowing the network to identify and correct errors transparently. When the environment provides safety, intrinsic motivation takes over, allowing for innovation to occur without being forced. Natural ecosystems thrive for millennia without burning out, a stark contrast to the exhaustion and turnover that plague modern leadership structures. We continue to rely on brutal rankings and rigid metrics that treat human beings like cogs in a machine, only to find that this kills the very creativity we need. The natural universe demonstrates a completely different architectural design, an elegant order that naturally arises from continuous flow rather than rigid force. The Tao represents that hidden pool, the architecture that regulates everything without demanding a visible, performative effort. The data from complexity science and psychology provides a modern empirical framework for Laozi's ancient intuition. Humans operate at their peak when the environment is built on safety and self-regulation. The solution isn't more micromanagement or more frantic control. Build an architecture of absolute trust. Step back and let the system organize itself. To find reality's baseline, we must look past human boundaries, cultural categories, and social rankings. What existed before we began drawing lines? The fourth chapter of the Daodejing tackles this question, offering a cosmological perspective on the origin of existence. It describes the Tao as a continuous, unlabeled current, a flow moving through the universe that is not defined by names or categories. This elemental essence represents a state of reality that is uncorrupted by human interpretation. Laozi outlines this with a specific claim: I do not know whose child it is. It seems to have existed before God itself. This perspective rejects socially conditioned identity. The text argues for a baseline that predates any system that tells you who you are or where you belong. By this logic, understanding reality requires stepping past artificial constructs to find an unfragmented origin point. To understand what the Tao is bypassing, we have to examine the ancient Chinese theological concept of Di, the supreme ancestor. Di was an anthropomorphic deity responsible for commanding earthly hierarchies. These mandates were used to dispense rewards and retributions, creating the framework for rigid social rankings. Humans modeled their own structures on this concept, separating the world into divine hierarchies and formalized rankings of power. Lao Tzu counters this highly ordered system by asserting that the Tao completely predates it. By placing the Tao before these structures, the text invites us to view the foundational state of existence as intrinsically unfragmented, making all authoritative, divine, and earthly hierarchies secondary additions. This ancient philosophical claim parallels the logic found in modern astrophysics. Cosmologists pursue a similar baseline when they attempt to understand the origins of the universe before the Big Bang. In the earliest epoch of cosmic history, before matter, light, or physical laws separated, The universe existed as an undifferentiated field of unity. As the universe expanded and cooled, it underwent a process known as primordial symmetry breaking. This star cluster breaking out of dense gas visualizes how that initial symmetry breaking resulted in the fragmented universe we observe today. The Tao functions like that pre-Big Bang state, representing the primordial, unfragmented baseline of reality. The astrophysical model aligns with the philosophical claim. In both domains, complexity and division are subsequent to a state of primordial unity. We can apply this same lens to developmental and family psychology to examine the internal human experience. Psychology recognizes a cognitive equivalent to this primordial baseline, known as the unconditioned mind. This state of consciousness exists early in development, before the introduction of comparative social conditioning. Research by Shiker and Mashesha measures what happens when this baseline is disrupted by parental differential treatment, or PDT. This diagram visualizes the mechanics of PDT, evaluating a child's worth relative to their siblings based on affection or parental control rules. The data shows this disruption causes status anxiety, identity distortion, and maladjustment in the subject. Comparative social sorting acts as a psychological symmetry breaking, fracturing a unified mind into a hierarchical identity. In modern life, this fragmentation is enforced by cultural labels, socioeconomic rank, income deciles, and comparative family brackets. These metrics contrast with the primordial code, which defines a field of unconditioned awareness. Society imposes these artificial values from birth, requiring individuals to measure themselves against external boundaries. The message of the Daodejing is that your core existence is prior to these imposed social titles. This realization posits that intrinsic worth operates independently of comparative metrics, offering a way to detach from the weight of social sorting. Who are you before the world assigns you a label? We are taught to calculate human worth using performance graphs, digital likes, and a corporate social ladder. The truth suggested by the ancient text is that this primordial current is older than our social metrics and older than early concepts of a ruling deity. The consequence of this is that your fundamental value is innate and unquantifiable. Attempting to calculate your worth in a social status race is a psychological trap that obscures your unconditioned origin. To find the baseline, we have to look past the games of social validation. It requires reconnecting with the unfragmented code of the original baseline. When you align with this perspective, you move toward a state of inner peace. You are no longer defined as a mere player in a hierarchical game. Your identity becomes an expression of the primeval source. Reclaiming this unconditioned awareness provides a framework for reconciling the self with its origins. It represents a final symmetry, the universe looking back at itself.